Honourable Senators, I rise today to speak to Bill C-69, the Impact Assessment Act. It should perhaps be called the No More Pipelines Bill. I cannot overemphasize the impact this legislation will have on Western Canada, including my home province of Saskatchewan. People in our region are already hurting. Since 2015, the oil and gas sector has seen more than 100,000 job losses and financial losses of more than $100 billion. With jobs lost, oil selling at a deep discount, pipelines stymied by the Liberal government at every turn, and investment in the sector drying up due to uncertainty and overregulation, workers, their families, and our communities are suffering. Yet this Trudeau government sits on its hands, focused more on appeasing anti-development interests to support their own political fortunes in the next election, rather than addressing the economic crisis facing one of the major engines of our Canadian economy. And now the Liberal government has introduced this disastrous legislation that will cripple the resource industry further by creating so much uncertainty and spiking so many projects that investment will freeze and Canada will be unable to compete in the global market. This Trudeau government is at best indifferent and at worst hostile to the plight of Western resource workers. The Prime Minister talks about phasing out the oil sands while his ministers muse about leaving oil in the ground. One would think Prime Minister Trudeau would take more of an interest in preserving the jobs of these middle-class Canadians, but unfortunately he is, as we say on the prairies, all hat, no cattle. Prime Minister Trudeau's only solution is to purchase the existing Trans Mountain pipeline with Canadian taxpayers' money for the steep sum of $4.5 billion. Further development of the Trans Mountain expansion is stalled. He's proved it's going nowhere when he didn't even include it in his fall economic statement. The Prime Minister has no other solutions and offers no other assistance. Instead, he introduces this punishing legislation that could have catastrophic consequences for an already suffering industry. As Senators, one of our most important roles is to represent the interests of our respective provinces and regions in Parliament. Of course, Bill C-69 will greatly affect Canada's western provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan, but Honourable Senators, you must also turn your minds to the effects that this issue will have in your own home regions. Canada's resource industries are the lifeblood of the entire Canadian economy. For every oil and gas job in Alberta, 7 manufacturing jobs are created in Ontario. The West contributes billions of dollars in equalization to Manitoba, Quebec, the Maritimes, and Newfoundland. Our bountiful region also provides much-needed jobs for Canadians from other provinces. How many Newfoundlanders and Maritimers have been employed in the oil and gas industry in Fort McMurray alone? The resource industry is also the biggest private sector employer of Indigenous Canadians and brings jobs to Canada's remote and northern communities. Think of the funding difference that lost $100 billion would make to Canada's economy, to the healthcare system, infrastructure, or programming needs. This resource crisis and this bill's impact on it should concern us all. Bill C-69 will be devastating. Just listen to what stakeholders and organizations have to say about this legislation. From Tim McMillan, Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, no new pipelines projects will go forward in Canada if this bill passes. The Ontario and Saskatchewan governments, the changes in the new Impact Assessment Act would result in a more complex, costly, and time-consuming process while creating uncertainty that could ultimately erode Canada's economic competitiveness. And from Martha Hall Findlay, Canada West Foundation, there is increasing consensus among business leaders, investors, potential investors, think tanks, academics, and others that the bill is not only problematic, it may not be fixable. Indeed, the problems with this bill are legion. One of the major problems I see with this bill is its massive federal overreach into provincial jurisdiction. Currently, mandatory factors, those conditions that must be considered in order to determine whether or not an environmental assessment is required, must be directly or incidentally related to federal jurisdiction. This changes under Bill C-69. This legislation stipulates that mandatory factors include, quote, adverse effects within federal jurisdiction or adverse direct or incidental effects, quote, meaning those effects falling outside of federal jurisdiction. The division of powers is integral to the Canadian Constitution. Without it, Canada would not be a country. Federal and provincial powers are mutually exclusive, what a 1931 British Privy Council decision referred to as watertight compartments. Bill C-69 muddies these waters and leaves the door open for federal encroachment into the provincial sphere. In a recent op-ed, Grant Bishop of the C.D. Howe Institute noted that traditionally, Canadian courts have been careful to ensure that federal impact assessments focus on effects related to federal jurisdiction. In the 1992 case, Friends of the Old Man River Society versus Canada, the Supreme Court of Canada warned that federal assessments should not be a, quote, constitutional Trojan horse, enabling the federal government on the pretext of some narrow ground of federal jurisdiction to conduct a far-ranging inquiry into matters that are exclusively within provincial jurisdiction, quote. Under Bill C-69, adverse effects, listed as a mandatory factor for assessment without necessarily being linked to the exercise of federal authority, could run afoul of the constitutional division of powers. Further, under Bill C-69, the specifics around regional assessments are lacking. There is no stipulation in this bill that provinces or regions should have the responsibility for regional assessments on provincial lands. The government must work with the provinces to rectify this. Another problem with Bill C-69 is that it undermines the joint management principles of the Atlantic Accord Acts. The governments of Canada and Newfoundland and Labrador jointly manage the Canada-Newfoundland offshore area through the Canada-Newfoundland Offshore Petroleum Board. As currently written, the Impact Assessment Act gives the federal minister and cabinet the power to pause, suspend, or cancel a project, potentially overriding the terms of the accord. This discretionary power creates the potential for further politicization of the process and increases uncertainty for project proponents. The province of Alberta also has concerns about federal intrusion on provincial rights through the bill's language around assessing Indigenous impacts. Alberta's NDP Premier Rachel Notley stated, quote, "It's not 100% clear because there is language around the health and the socioeconomic and the implications for Indigenous people, and that opens the door in a way that potentially invites the Government of Canada into the process in a way that is unprecedented from the past, and that is why we're really not sure how the two line up. We have seen other documentation from the federal government under Indigenous relations suggest they think they have sort of an untethered ability to just march into provincial jurisdiction and completely rewrite the rules where it impacts Indigenous rights, and that there's no need for the province to even be there. And that's why there is uncertainty that is driving our concern," quote. The provinces have right to be worried, as this Trudeau government has a habit of trying to shove them around. For a government that initially promised more consultation with the provinces, their actions don't seem to bear that out. We saw this recently during the legalization of marijuana, for example, when the Trudeau government completely disregarded the rights of provinces like Manitoba and Quebec, who want to ban homegrown marijuana plants within their provincial borders. The Trudeau government has also tried to impose its plans on the provinces with its federal carbon tax scheme. One by one, the provincial premiers are now turning their back on Trudeau's abominable carbon tax. I'm proud to say that the first province to oppose the tax was Saskatchewan. We have since been joined by Ontario, Manitoba, and New Brunswick, and it's so nice to have company. Canada's provinces are fed up with the federal government trying to dictate affairs that fall within provincial jurisdiction. At last week's First Minister's meeting, Prime Minister Trudeau's biggest win was that no one stormed out of the meeting. I guess it's good to keep one's expectations low. Sunny ways, my friends, sunny ways. What's not so sunny, though, is the way that this Trudeau government is treading on the jurisdiction of the provinces with Bill C-69 and with the carbon tax before the courts have settled the question of whether the federal government has the exclusive right to regulate greenhouse gases. This Liberal government likes to pretend it respects the courts, but with both this bill and their elections bill, C-76, it is failing to wait for relevant determinations by the courts before ramming through legislation. Just as Bill C-69 is vague about federal and provincial jurisdiction, it is also vague about the conditions that must be considered during an impact assessment. Whereas the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act of 2012 spelled out the federal jurisdiction over projects and their assessments, Trudeau's Bill C-69 broadens the number and scope of mandatory factors that the minister or cabinet must consider. The bill defines effects as, quote, changes to the environment or to health, social, or economic conditions and the positive and negative consequences of these changes, quote. What effects specifically are included here? Federal, provincial? How significant must these effects be? Could a group of 5 frogs be sufficient to warrant an impact assessment? Could one? Further, Bill C-69 changes the focus of the assessment from significant adverse environmental effects to that of public interest, which again is too broad. In the absence of specific criteria for determining the public interest, political considerations will undoubtedly influence the decision-making process. Time and again, we have seen this Trudeau government insert its own partisan interests into supposedly impartial processes. We need only remember the Canada Summer Jobs fiasco, where the Trudeau government forced nonprofit organizations to declare their beliefs and values on issues like abortion in order to obtain government funding for student summer jobs. In this bill, the Trudeau government has added additional ill-defined factors that must be considered in impact assessments, including a project's contribution to sustainability and its effects on the government's environmental obligations. Strangely enough, the mandatory factors don't seem to include the economic effects of a given project. However, the project will be judged on the, quote, intersection of sex and gender with other identity factors. What does that even mean? Recently, the Prime Minister maligned male construction workers as having negative gender impacts on rural communities. But what would those impacts be? He won't elaborate. Prime Minister Trudeau swans about the globe bragging of his gender-based budgeting, but then refuses to release any gender analysis of his federal carbon tax scheme. Could it be that might reveal an answer unflattering to Liberal policy? Then you can be sure we won't get an answer on that. And where is this government's gender-based analysis of foreign oil imports from countries like Saudi Arabia? This Liberal government trots out gender issues only when it is politically advantageous to them in some way. How can we be sure that a minister's evaluation of a project relying on some nebulous, highly politicized criteria would result in a fair evaluation? At root, this is the whole problem with Bill C-69, as with the Trudeau government's entire approach towards resource issues in Canada. It's all about empty platitudes and electoral politics, not economic investment or even environmental stewardship. This Liberal government is prepared to sell out the West, steamroll over provincial jurisdiction, and devastate an entire industry in its pursuit of power. The Trudeau government has bungled the pipeline file, squandering a tremendous economic opportunity through its own incompetence and indifference. Ultimately, it is Canada as a whole who will suffer. Honourable Senators, it is for these reasons that I ask you to consider your decision on this bill very carefully. What we decide in this place matters. This Trudeau government brought more than 150 amendments on Bill C-69, their own bill, to the House of Commons committee. They tried to fix this bill, and they failed. Bill C-69 is unfixable, and its ramifications for our entire Canadian economy are dire. For the good of Canada, I ask you to take the unusual step of voting against this bill at second reading. Canada cannot afford to pass Bill C-69. It's time to kill this bill for the sake of our nation. Thank you.